Ayo Akinwolere here, and welcome to the Athletic FC podcast. So Ruben Amorim's Manchester United have got off to a decent start. For this one, I'm joined by the Athletic's Phil Hay, plus a representative from both sides, our Manchester United writer Carl Anka and one of our Arsenal writers, Art de Roche. Carl, let's start with you. 2 wins and 1 draw for Ruben Amorim at Manchester United. This is actually the first time United have a better goal difference than City in 10 or more games into a Premier League season since the end of the 2012-13 campaign. What have you made of Amorim's start so far? And I know it's a small sample size so far.
The most telling thing about Ruben Amorim is he seems to understand how the Gen Z footballer thinks. He comes across as a very confident, charismatic speaker in press conferences. He's mentioned a couple of interesting things about how he looks into fitness and player care. So this doesn't sound groundbreaking, but if you're on the Man United beat, sometimes it's just nice to have a manager go, if a player plays in midweek, they're not going to train again for the next 2 days after that. So they might be slowly coming back into the lineup for the weekend game as well. He also mentioned something quite interesting the other day. Obviously, when you're a Portuguese manager, you're inevitably compared to Jose Mourinho. He said he's a bit different to Mourinho. He also said when Mourinho entered the Chelsea dressing room in 2004, he had players like Frank Lampard in there, and things are a little bit different now. I thought that was really interesting because there's an old France football interview in 2017 when Mourinho, then the United manager, said 23-year-olds of now, the modern era, are not like the 23-year-olds of the Frank Lampard era. He said, he was essentially going, these darn kids can't look after themselves as well. Amorim's ability to grasp that on day one makes me think, okay, I'm not sure if you're going to win the Premier League anytime soon, but you are going to be able to get players under the age of 25 to be willing to run through brick walls for you. And I think at Manchester United, that's the most important thing. He's someone that can get buy-in at a time where many United players and the fan base at large has been quite fractured.
Okay, Art, as we're comparing and contrasting both teams, as they're obviously going to be playing this week, I'm just thinking about the situation Amorim's inherited versus perhaps the situation Arteta inherited, in 2019. Any stark differences, comparisons?
I think with Arsenal at that time, they were at a point where their players were of 2 different profiles. And obviously the situation at Manchester United over the past, I'd probably say 7 or 8 years, is their squad's been a mixture of a lot of different managers' players. So Erik ten Hag, even going back down to Louis van Gaal, who gave Marcus Rashford his debut. And I think that was maybe a similar situation that Arsenal and Arteta had to deal with, because he had some of Wenger's players, but also he had Unai Emery's players as well. And he really worked hard to kind of flush out and clean the squad. We've spoken about that a lot. The one survivor from his start in 11 in his first game is Bukayo Saka. And I think if you're looking at Manchester United's starting 11 from Ipswich, I'm not saying that it's just going to be one player, but I think you've got at least a few players there who are young enough and talented enough to maybe be those sparks that can really be almost the flag bearers for what Amorim wants from his Manchester United side.
Okay, Phil, you're looking at when Arteta took over at Manchester United. Obviously, there was Unai Emery just in between, but taking over from someone like Arsene Wenger, it is massive. You look at the stature of the club, and I wonder how Amorim wears the stature of Manchester United. I mean, time will definitely tell, but do you think Amorim is probably a little bit more equipped than perhaps when Arteta started to take on a club of this stature?
I would assume so, yes, on the basis of his record at Sporting in Portugal. And on the basis of his record there alone, you can tell that he's a really good coach. And I think United have done the right thing by doing what Liverpool did with Arne Slot, which is looking for a sensible option, but also a top-tier option that you can kind of credibly put forward as someone who has earned the stripes and deserves to coach the club. But you're not worrying so much about it being, an absolute sort of Hollywood appointment. It doesn't need to be that. And I think Carl's right. He will understand the modern player. He clearly does, because of how well it went for him in Portugal. There's a definite difference, I think, between Manchester United and Arsenal, in that, unless I was reading it wrong, I think there was that thing, I spoke on the podcast yesterday about, Klopp at Liverpool. Do you get to a point where familiarity breeds contempt? And that certainly seemed to be the case with Wenger at Arsenal towards the end. There was a groundswell for a change when Wenger left. So Arsenal, in a lot of ways, were ready for a new broom, ready for a bit of a new approach. Didn't work with Emery. But I think they realised something that United are going to have to realise as well, which is that with Arteta, they needed to stick with it. They needed to go with it, invest in it, and let it play out over a reasonable length of time. And again, that's going to have to happen with Amorim. I think the good thing for Amorim is that he's far enough on now from the retirement of Sir Alex Ferguson that he's not really in that shadow. I know it's everywhere at Manchester United. I know that the whole sort of tapestry of their success, the back end of the 20th century, early 21st century, is covered in Ferguson. But there's been so much flux in between Ferguson retiring and Amorim arriving that I don't think that it's a distraction anymore. I don't think it's really going to put pressure on him from the outside. And I think he will have the space and the freedom to have a good run at this. I think at Old Trafford, you always need good results, and he needs to be so much better than Erik ten Hag, who remains a complete mystery to me, to be quite honest. But I think it is a sensible appointment. I like what he said so far. I think him arriving and talking about how much of a shock he'd found the media commitments, landing in England, to find that the sheer number of broadcast rights holders you have that you have to speak to pre-match and post-match tells you that he would rather coach in the background than he would be front and centre. And I don't think that's a bad thing.
Yeah. Carl, very quickly, we've spoken about the shift in squad that Arteta's had to make since he took over. I'm just thinking about United, actually. Defensively, for sure, I can see where tweaks will have to be made. But all round, is this a slightly better squad that Amorim has to work with than perhaps when Mikel Arteta came into Arsenal?
No.
I'm listening.
Bluntly.
Go on.
No. Arteta, in my opinion, Arteta had two strikers that gave you a boxer's chance or a puncher's chance of winning games in Lacazette and Alba. Yes, the central midfield absolutely needed work, and there were questions as to which of their defenders was actually of the requisite quality. But what I would say Arsenal's advantage was that they had fewer, to my mind, financial considerations and FFP considerations to balance with. So the ability to churn was there. I'd also say, if you're talking about the transition, how you have to change when you replace someone, going from Wenger, who had a very obvious way of playing, to Emery, who had a very obvious way of playing, to then Arteta could begin his process quicker because he was undoing the, let's say, errors of only two managers, whereas Amorim's come in, he's got to sift through whatever Erik ten Hag was trying to do. And much like Phil, I was in those press conferences and there were times where I was asking Erik ten Hag some questions and was coming away even more confused afterwards due to his explanations. He also has to go through some of the players that were there during the lockdown seasons and some of Ole Gunnar Solskjaer seasons, players that, while may have been very good on Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, are perhaps not the same physical capacity anymore. So, Luke Shaw, one player of the season on Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, he's not now able to play Premier League minutes to the same level as then. There's also, like we say, there are players that have been there for a little bit longer. A player like Victor Lindelof, he's been there under Jose Mourinho. A player like Marcus Rashford, who was under Louis van Gaal. So it's multiple managers you have to sift through in order to build this sort of coherent squad and a mess. So I'm not saying Arteta had it easy. No manager has it easy in the Premier League. But I do think there were, in terms of the short list of things you have to sort out before you can do what you need to do, I think Arteta's list is a bit shorter than Ruben Amorim. I do think Phil's saying about outside pressure not being as high on Amorim, that does make me laugh just a little bit, because he's been in charge for 3 games, and I've already sat in a press conference as a journalist has gone, so how long do you think this is going to take? Right? We can talk about pressure from the fan base, but there is also, and I think this is every big club has their own sort of pressures, but there is a almost odd media fascination with Manchester United, where every other press conference, especially around a big game, goes, so How long do you think it's going to take for United to win a trophy? Do you remember when United were good against Arsenal? Do you remember when United were good going into the Manchester derby? Do you remember when United were good playing Liverpool? How long do you think it will take for that to happen again? Amorim's in a really interesting situation now, I think, where this Arsenal game, I think some fans are going to treat this as a free hit and say this is a bit too early to make assessments. But if a positive result, and I'm not even saying a win, occurs, oh boy.
He fits the mould of a project, though, doesn't he? I think that's the difference. If you parachute somebody like Van Halen or Mourinho, you're not pretending that that's a kind of long-term game plan at all, and you kind of expect immediate results because of who they are. I think Amorim, I mentioned earlier, reminds me a lot of Slot at Liverpool, in that it makes it a bit easier, I think, to think of it transitionally and to think of this as being a play that you've got to let, sort of self out, act by act. To say, is it a bit too soon for Arsenal away? I mean, it absolutely is. He's hardly been in the door for a month. It's not a game I'd expect them to get anything from, to be quite honest. But I think if you give it 6 months and they play again, then the attitude would probably be different.
Yeah. Just on the timing and I guess patience, I think with Arteta the big thing was his personality was a lot different to that of Emery's, and I think what Carl mentioned at the top of the podcast in terms of Amorim's observations and his way of voicing those in press conferences is probably a very good sign, because from, I think, minute one, you could tell Mikel Arteta wasn't there just to be a head coach. And we've spoken again at length about how his role changed from head coach to manager within 8 months of taking the job. So I think to be in that position and almost be a vehicle of change, you need to have a big personality. And it seems like Amorim is a different type of personality, but still a pretty big one, which should help.
Right, Carl, let's talk about this Manchester United squad right now. It's only been a few games for sure, but in terms of Amorim's influence, you've spoken about his understanding of Gen Z players. Any more that you've seen so far in terms of how he's slowly influencing the way this team is playing? Well,
the big headline that a lot of United fans are focusing on is the fact that Amorim likes a 3-4-3. He's managed more than 225 games at Sporting. And I'd want to say basically a handful of them didn't use a 3-4-3 or 3-4-2-1. There have been questions, including from me, about the difference between a wing back and a full back. And Amorim at this point has said, please don't get too bogged down on the formations, which is a bit similar to what several other managers say in the Premier League of, the starting formation is just a starting formation. Things change during build-up and when you're in possession and out of possession and whatnot. And Amorim said the most important thing is the idea and the idea of what they're trying to play. The idea so far seems to be Amad Diallo is one of the greatest football players of all time.
I mean, you've been backing him for a while. It's finally come good, right?
I have. The young Ivorian's been playing at right wing back and he has been quite impressive. He's not the biggest football player, which I think has made some managers in the past reluctant to use him. But he's got a very, very good left foot. He's very good at dribbling, very clever in tight spaces. There have been 2 or 3 times in United games where I think he's taken some of his teammates by surprise because it looks like he's run down a corridor and he's about to lose the ball, but managed to wriggle away and then get a pass away. And the player sort of thought, oh, wasn't expecting that. Ruud van Nistelrooy seemed to enjoy Amad during his interim stint there. And also there's been 2 or 3 instances where United players very clearly are drawn to Amad when Amad is in possession. I've seen Bruno Fernandes get onto the ball and sort of put his head up and look left and right and go, where is he? Where can I get the ball to him? And in the the most recent win against Everton, after the 3rd goal where Amad teed up Marcus Rashford, there was a second where Amad got onto the ball again down the right-hand side, and I saw Marcus sprint top speed to try and offer an overlapping run. Only just as he was approaching Amad just offered his hand like, just wait, slow down, you'll get yours as well. Which I think is interesting. It's an interesting thing right now. This is a team that for, I want to say the majority of this calendar year, it was quite hard to figure out what Erik ten Hag was trying to do. This was a team that was trying to press really, really high up, but the back line was quite deep, which created this very large gap in midfield. That gap got away to being plugged under Van Nistelrooy, and now Amorim has come with his own version of how he wants to fix things. this use of two dual 10s behind the centre forward is also quite interesting. And yes, this is all early. This is all a work in progress. This United team is not at the level of Amorim's Sporting team, the one that beat Manchester City 4-1 in the Champions League, let alone the team at the top of the Premier League summer at this point in time. But there are signs that something is coming along, and there are signs that 2 or 3 players, most notably Ahmad, are beginning to enjoy this.
Yeah, very quickly on that, Marcus Rashford, Xerxes to a certain degree. Should United fans, with a caveat that there's a new coach bounce, and with a caveat that it's still a small sample size, be excited to see a connection of ideas and an implementation of that on the pitch?
I think the interesting thing was Xerxes had a difficult start to the season, scores in the opening weekend against Fulham, and then doesn't score again until Everton, and he looked out of sorts. We knew that Xerxes is not a penalty box operator in the same way that, say, a player like Diogo Jota is, or in the same way that, say, Kai Havertz can be. But the idea, or it seemed like Xerxes was going to offer link-up play. He was going to be the sort of player who could drop deep, collect long passes, and then play in the inverted forwards on Erik ten Hag. That didn't come to pass. He looked a little laconic to the point of being horizontal, and the way he passed just wasn't quite at it. Whereas what seems to have happened on Amorim is that in playing in this 3-4-3 with those 2 players closer to him, he doesn't have to hold the ball up for that extra fraction of a second. He can get the ball away quicker. So that's been interesting. Rashford's experimentation on Amorim's been interesting. First used as a number 9, now used as a number 10. I think his implementation will change depending on the personnel. It seems like Amorim, he just had a comment about how Rashford's position in centre forward wasn't great because he had to duel with 2 large giants. And I think it's also important when we talk about Amorim. Amorim keeps talking about physicality. He keeps saying Manchester United need to be more physical, but he also describes it as a loop. So the team has to be very physical out of possession because the team right now isn't quite precise in possession. And if they can get better at using the ball when they win the ball, they don't have to be so aggressive in their counter-pressing and pressing, which, again, things that shouldn't be revelatory, but so often at a club the size of Manchester United, actually explaining how the team works can get forgotten about. So that is interesting. I'm talking to you right now, having rewatched Arsenal's first half against West Ham, and I am absolutely terrified of Gabriel on set pieces. Absolutely terrified.
Xerxes is really interesting though, because in the Athletics deal sheet last week, the big breakdown of who might do what in 2025 in the transfer market, there was a little reference to Xerxes which said that there have been conversations at United about the possibility that they might cash out on him after a year. So already doubting whether that's been good for them and having buyer's remorse. It has to be said, not for the first time or even the second with players who they've signed. I suspect he's probably got a bit of time on his side, and Amorim will give him the chance to show what he's about and give him a chance to blossom a little bit more. But that probably underlines the fact that it's going to go badly wrong for Amorim unless the recruitment improves drastically at Old Trafford. And if it does, then I think he'll do a really good job there. Actually, if he doesn't, then he'll go the way of all things.
I think what's also interesting is to go back to Art's point. Amorim right now is the head coach, but in his first press conference, he used the word manager 2 or 3 times. So I'm going, okay. So you're the first head coach in Manchester United history, really. Not to get the managerial term, but he sounds as if he might get the manager term eventually if things go well. In terms of recruitment, one thing also that was quite interesting is obviously Amorim has been repeatedly asked about United's goal scoring or lack thereof this season, which Amorim in one press conference went, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here, essentially went, you want me to say I want Gyökeres, but I'm not going to say that. He said, we need to improve as a team. He said, we need to improve as a team. I think Bruno Fernandes can score more goals. I think Ahmad can score more goals. I think other players can score more goals. And I think, crucially, one player who I think gets overlooked as to how good he is and how good he can be is Rasmus Højlund. I think he was misused and misprofiled for the majority of his first season. He was sort of used as this sort of Olivier Giroud style target man, whereas to my eye, he is a very Ollie Watkins style channel runner. And if he gets a good run of games, which may go up and down based on rotation, I think you could see a quality 15 Premier League goal a season striker there.
Okay, Carl, I know you've got to go. Thank you for your time. Really good analysis, actually. I really enjoyed that. Thanks, brother.
Thank you. I'll see you in January, Art.
Carl talks about been very worried about Gabriel. Arsenal look like, a team that things look to be clicking at this moment in time. Let's bring this back to Manchester United for that reason. Mm-hmm. Do you think this 3-4-3 system, there are other spaces for Arsenal to exploit within this?
Well, the obvious one is the right-hand side for Arsenal. So with Ødegaard back, and I'm sure we'll touch on it a bit more, the relationship he has with Saka and the pockets they can get into. If Manchester United's left wing back is a bit too high, or if their left-sided centre-back is not wide enough, I think it would be quite interesting to see how those players combine in those moments. But then if you look at the 3-4-3 in general, Arsenal have come up against that with Amorim when they played Sporting in the Europa League a couple of seasons ago, and they didn't win either game. They actually got knocked out over two legs. So I don't think it's going to be an easy situation for Arsenal, even though maybe there will be a few more spaces that don't kind of pop up naturally in games where they play against a back four.
Yeah, Phil, just very quickly before we move on to Arsenal. Communication of ideas is really interesting. I think we've touched on it with Amorim. Is it quite impressive and also comforting as well, potentially for Man United fans, that you've got someone that's like, this is where I see it going wrong, this is what I want to fix, and obviously it will take time to do that, but he's been very vocal about it, which I think is really, really refreshing.
I think the reassurance more comes from what he's done in Portugal with Sporting, and again that kind of links back to my confusion about Ten Hag, because I liked Ten Hag's team at Ajax, and it gave you the impression of somebody who was pretty tactically savvy and knew how to build a very, very strong Champions League team, certainly in that season where they went closest, without the depth of resource that you had elsewhere. And when you saw who was pinching which players from Ajax, you realised how highly rated they were elsewhere, and the sort of scale of the development that had been done with them. And then came to Old Trafford, where he just looked perennially out of his depth, and it kind of no idea of how to fix things that were going wrong, or to rectify the ways in which they were falling short. But Amorim again comes with a really good record from Sporting, and I think has reached the point where he needs this test and this challenge. You would hope that he can see what the problems are, and you would hope that he would have fixes up his sleeve. I don't think it's the done thing for many coaches to come in and say, look, I really don't have a clue about this, and we'll just have to see what goes on. It's proper.
Here's
it's
a couple
proper
of million
proof.
quid. You know what you're doing.
It's proper proof of the pudding. You know, in the same way that in the summer people are talking about Xerxes' potential and what made him a great youngster and why he developed, but then you get to December and we're writing about the possibility that it will be a year for him at Old Trafford and no more than that. Let's say, for what it's worth, I think Xerxes might get a longer run, but he just seems very sort of level-headed, Amorim, and I think the drum that he has to bang constantly is that this does have to be a project. Managers these days always want projects. When they go to a club, that's what they're looking for. They're not really looking for a quick hit somewhere and then move on. Certainly not at the very top level. And it is going to require that, and it is going to take that. And I get that over at Liverpool, you've got this kind of unexpected title challenge developing quicker than anybody else expected. But I don't honestly believe that Slot going in there would have thought that this was how the table was going to look. I think he would have felt like a steady season in which he ticked a lot of boxes and kept people happy would have been, the right sort of start for him. I still feel with Amorim that in order to make any proper judgment of him, he's going to have to go through first January, in which there might not be a lot of recruitment at Old Trafford anyway, but then the summer in which there needs to be plenty, and there needs to be plenty that works, and then see how it's shaping up next season. I think these, even though might not be the way it's been at Old Trafford in eras gone by, this might need to be a period where he beds in, works out exactly what he's got, and then goes from June onwards.
So what about Arsenal? A few weeks ago, this might have been a bit of a tricky fixture for them, but it feels like they've kind of got their groove back. James McNicholas wrote on The Athletic off the back of the win at West Ham at the weekend that they have got their groove back. So let's see, Art. They've won 3 on a spin across all competitions. What has been the reason for this upturn? Is it as easy as saying Martin Ødegaard's back, all the problems are solved at Arsenal?
It could be that easy, but I don't think we'll take that route fully. On Ødegaard, I think what you see is he's someone who's the glue basically. In possession, he does so much. I think that link up we spoke about in terms of him and Saka earlier, it's so natural, and you saw in the Nottingham Forest game, it just, he does things off the cuff that are pleasing to the eye, that aren't as predictable as Arsenal were in the first, say, between September and November when he was injured. And that just helps open teams up. But then aside from that, Leandro Trossard's actually got into a bit more form. He had a dip, I'd say, late November, but off the bench against Sporting in the week, and then from the start against West Ham, he looked a lot better. In that West Ham game, you actually, I think, saw a lot of themes from Arsenal's 6-0 win against West Ham last season. So Gabriel scoring again from a corner. I was actually on holiday last week, and we were watching the game in Germany at a pub, and once Arsenal got that corner, you could see Gabriel just waiting, and we kind of all knew it was
inevitable, right?
What was going to happen. And I think with those set piece routines, Arsenal have actually been a bit different in how they approach them. Last year was obviously Ben White around the goalkeeper, but they've had to change because of the rules, and I think they found a real groove with that. And then aside from that, I just think the confidence of being able to play a bit more freely is something that they're really benefiting from. And just the last word on Odegaard, out of possession, I think you see how hard he works and how he is able to bring the team a lot higher up the pitch, and naturally that makes Arsenal a lot more dominant as well.
What do you think has changed, though? What has gone on in the background, do we know? Because, this time last season, we were talking about that wonderful trip to Dubai. And that's obviously not happened because people have been on international duty. But the team pre-international duty versus the team after it, almost polar opposites in a weird way.
Yeah, Mikel Arteta before the break did joke about having to maybe do something. He said maybe sending them to Las Vegas for a couple of days.
Not Vegas, man, please.
I'm sure they didn't actually do that. But I think the kind of change would have been in maybe the time players like Saka maybe got not going away to England. Obviously, Declan Rice was actually injured and didn't go to England as well. So I think they may have had more time with Odegaard too, who didn't go with Norway, to maybe just have conversations that they didn't have time to when it was a game every 3 days. So that's probably one thing. But then also, I do feel like there was a little bit of a change in that Chelsea game where you could see they changed the shape a little bit from the 4-4-2 that got stale, and they went back to a three in midfield, which looked a lot more natural. So I think now, almost similar to the Dubai trip, they had a little bit of time that wasn't afforded to them beforehand, where they could almost hit the reset button. And thankfully, from an Arsenal perspective, they've actually benefited from that.
Yeah, Phil, we talk about Odegaard, but you cannot forget the impact Bukayo Saka is making this season, and he's been growing quite comfortably as a player over the last few years. 10 assists in Arsenal's 13 Premier League games this season, and only Cesc Fabregas, Mesut Ozil and Harry Kane have reached 10 assists in fewer of a team's games from the start of the season in the competition. Now, he's gone another level this season, hasn't he? There's a sense of maturity there, not just in his link-up play, but I don't know how players just don't seem to be able to stop him scoring that very similar goal he scores. He just peels off, pings it in on his left foot.
Well, he's the finesse, isn't he? Him and Odegaard. I mean, Arsenal are quite a functional team, and I don't mean that as an insult. They're really impressively functional, but they're not uberly ambitious in the way they play under Arteta. They don't take massive risks, and I wouldn't say that Arteta's football is particularly reinventing the wheel, but once you put Odegaard and Saka into that team, it does look like a completely different side, in the sense that you can see the threat all the time, and you know that you have players who will score goals, but will also create, which is crucial for them. I mean, it's not only an open play from Saka. I remember a few months ago us talking about Arsenal's set pieces, and I was asking Ned Manure about, how much difference does it make? Okay, you've got a set piece coach, which Arsenal do, and clearly a very savvy one, and a guy with lots of ideas. But how much does it all rest on having Gabriel, for example, who is just the best header of the ball in an attacking sense anywhere at the moment, and Saka, who seems to be able to place these deliveries on the same 9-inch spot time and time again, which are almost impossible to defend because of the whip on them and where they're being positioned, and very easy to score because you have people like Gabriel who are basically just there to eat them up. So it can't be a coincidence that Odegaard returning has given Arsenal a little bit more spark. But at the same time, I do feel like Arsenal were causing some of their own problems, particularly the red cards in games that I suspect they would otherwise have won had they not had players sent off. And yes, they were pretty flat against Newcastle, but even Liverpool, it was points dropped against a really good team who are top of the division. Chelsea are proving to be a decent side. And I think, again, to go back to deal sheet, it was kind of referencing the fact that Chelsea don't intend to do very much in January. And I think after, kind of constantly twisting in the transfer market, Chelsea are at the point now where they're thinking, do you know what, let's let this ride, because actually this looks pretty good. And maybe we've fallen on something between Maresca and the squad that's going to work. So I don't think a draw against them was a bad result. And I think you could fairly say that were it not for the fact that Liverpool are having this spectacular run of form and the finest start they've ever seen under a manager, so good on the slot, table would be a bit more forgiving for Arsenal. And I don't think it would, I don't think people would reflect on their start to the season quite as they have. I think whereas there is clearly a crisis going on at Manchester City, I think Arsenal are okay. They just find themselves, away adrift of a side who can't stop winning games.
Yeah, very quickly on this, I'm just thinking about, actually, I've got two questions for you. I'll start with the first one. Should Arsenal fans still be wary of the fact that sometimes Arsenal do go ahead and they do end up conceding? West Ham, I know, obviously Arsenal ended up winning that emphatically, but there was a point in which it was a bit touch and go, and the team then puts itself under pressure that it doesn't need to because it's doing so well comfortably.
Yeah, I do feel that's a point that I am definitely wary of, because it's a theme that's cropped up not just this year, but last year as well, and the year before that even. So it does seem like there are games where Arsenal should be comfortable and they end up shooting themselves in the foot. So I feel like going into this game, what makes me feel a bit more optimistic is that they do seem to smell blood a lot faster and a lot better in this little spell of games. It seems like they're really almost wired in on what they have to do. And of course, the goals they conceded against West Ham, you could say they were needless, but they were already in a position where they were at arm's length anyway. So I think going into Manchester United, they tend to do well against them at the Emirates. It's almost like a reverse of each other. Arsenal didn't win there for 4 years before they beat them at Old Trafford in May, but at the Emirates they tend to do all right against Manchester United.
And very quickly on that, in the positive, if we're going on that, is that where will Arsenal be a danger against Manchester United? We've talked about set pieces, but you can't ignore what's going on that right side with Saka and Odegaard, but also even the likes of Trossard, Martinelli as well, linking up to that, and dare I say, Kai Havertz popping up out of nowhere with a cheeky little tap in. Yeah,
what's really encouraged me about Havertz in the last few games is his, I guess, movement to get into, say, the 6-yard box against Sporting. He was there if Saka picked him out instead of Trossard against West Ham. He was making that run into the 6-yard box again. So that's been really encouraging. But on Saka, I think this year, throughout his career, he's always had a self-belief and no fear about him in the way he plays. But I think this year he's really added a football arrogance that's been pleasing to see. I think the first day of the season he scores and he does this little shrug celebration. That's kind of almost developed into what would you call it? Almost like a stop talking
arrogance. A kind of like, I've still got it. Don't underwrite me. I got you.
A stop talking.
It's a swagger, isn't it?
Yeah.
He's got a lovely swagger, but it's quite endearing. I don't see a whole lot of arrogance in Saka, or not in a negative sense.
No,
I think it really positive influence. And you remember us talking about Reece James, captain in Chelsea, and how that's a tough role for him. I think Saka almost seems like he's more tailor-made for that kind of role, and seems to be what he's taking on. I sort of feel with the game against United that if Arteta's got anything about him, and he does clearly, he'll be talking a lot about Arsenal avoiding getting countered by Manchester United. We haven't got a whole lot to judge Amorim on so far, and I don't feel like we can yet draw much in the way of kind of real conclusions. But there's been quite a bit going on out wide for his team so far, particularly on Ahmed's side of the field. And I think although Arteta will want to dominate at the Emirates, from a defensive point of view, that's what he'll be looking at.
Yeah, I must say also Amorim's played Arteta before, so he knows what he's facing. And very quickly, Phil, you sort of touched on it in terms of the title race early, in terms of how well Liverpool are doing. We spoke about City yesterday, sort of feeling like it might not be theirs this season. Is it too far gone for Arsenal as well in that respect? And I know we're seeing a team gallop forward with a better form, but is the point difference just a bit too much?
It's going to depend. We were chatting before we recorded yesterday about whether we see Arsenal being 10 points better than Liverpool over what's left of the season. And that seems like a fair ask, unless Liverpool are going to have a wobble. And I think that is something that Arsenal are going to have to rely on. I don't think Arsenal will fall much further back from here, and I think they obviously will have the chance to take points from Liverpool head to head at Anfield. The problem for them most likely is that looking at the way Liverpool are playing on the slot, and if this is a sign of how consistent they're going to be through the season, Liverpool will pick up a lot of good results against 75-80% of the division, which makes them really, really difficult to catch. 9 points is not insurmountable at all, and there was a piece on our website on Monday, which was or over the weekend, I think, which was going over the previous deficits that have been clawed back, and there've been bigger gaps than that. But it is a fair old lead, and I think Arteta would want to be closer than this before he started shouting the odds.
Yeah, I'm going to ask for score predictions in just a second because Carl's managed to run away quite early. But is the point gap too much, or should Arsenal fans have faith in this team to just keep going? Because if you think about it, it has to be 100% from this point onwards to the end of the season, and we've got December on its way.
No, I don't think the point gap is too much. When you look at Arsenal in recent seasons, the first year they went on a title challenge with Manchester City, there was a point where they were 8 points in front and they still got clawed back. I know it was Manchester City doing the chasing, so it was very different. But there's an example in recent history where a team has been very far or seemed very far in front and not got over the line. So yeah, in my opinion, it's still all to play for. And I think that's something that Mikel Arteta will believe. And when you look at Liverpool, as Phil said earlier, they wouldn't have expected to be in this situation at this point in the season. Arsenal didn't when they had their first title run. So it'd be interesting to see how they deal with December, January as well, because in that period, Arsenal only leave London once, and that's to go to Brighton, whereas Liverpool have a lot of away games. I think they still have to go to Newcastle, a few more trips to London as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that aspect of the game may impact both teams.
Okay, very quickly, Phil, as the neutral in this conversation, what do you reckon the score's going to be at the Emirates? Arsenal versus Manchester United on Wednesday.
I think it'll be Arsenal by a couple of goals. Don't forget that Arteta will know that they absolutely have to win this game, and I think they'll play with that in mind.
Art?
3-1 Arsenal.
I'm not going to give my prediction. I don't want to curse it. Just leave it at that. Art, I know you've got to head off. Thank you so much for your time, bro. All right, before we go, Phil, let's take a look at a couple of the other big games in the Premier League this week. You know, the standout fixture, Newcastle versus Liverpool. You know, we spoke last week with James Pearce and Simon Hughes about 4 huge fixtures for Liverpool. Well, they've already beaten Real Madrid and Manchester City. So a trip to St James's Park, considering where Newcastle are at right now, should be a walk in the park, right?
You would think so. And I expect they'll have the beating of Newcastle, who do feel really flat and kind of stale this season. I think if ever a squad was needing an injection of something, it's definitely the one at St James's Park at the moment. I mean, everything at Liverpool, aside from talk of the title, seems to be about Mo Salah at the moment. And I thought it was fascinating, actually, the story that popped up yesterday about the fact that Salah is frustrated about what's going on with his contract, which I think we could all deduce from him appearing from nowhere to kind of say to people, look, I'm more out than in. I think that was very much him kind of trying to say to people, I want to stay, but there's nothing doing here. but also that he would take a 1 year extension, which doesn't strike you as a massive commitment from Liverpool's point of view, and seems like a total no-brainer given that the form that Salah's in. It's not like you're talking about having to commit to him to the point of him being 34, 35, 36, where he might feasibly have gone over the hill. You know, you're talking about another 12 months when he's looking as fresh and as good as he is at the moment. So I'm quite a little bit difficult to know what Liverpool are thinking about this and why they're letting it play out in this way. And I think the consequence of it is that Arne Slot has been asked again and again and again about it. You know, every press conference, especially because Salah is scoring so much, you know, what's happening with him. And you might have seen his press conference this morning where he kind of got sucked into joking about, you know, when Salah said over the weekend, this might be my last game against City, Slot said, you know, that he was just joking because he thinks that the 115 financial charges, or however many it is in reality, are going to get Manchester City relegated. And Slot's PR to this point has been really good. You know, it's been like exemplary. He's carried himself so well. And you could tell that as soon as he said that, he regretted making that joke. And he said at the end, you know, this is just a joke, just to repeat, you know, I'm just having a bit of a laugh here. But he'll look back at that this afternoon, I'm sure, and think, I shouldn't have said that. It was not really very helpful. It's not really particularly diplomatic either. But that's what happens when you get stuck in these conversations. And it does seem to me with Salah that it would be a good idea to sort this out ASAP. And from what Salah's saying, you know, from what we're hearing from his side of things, it shouldn't be that complicated to do.
Right, let's move on to Newcastle at the moment. And I did say their form in this moment in time isn't that great. And also, I guess, an underwhelming campaign so far. You know, there were some interesting remarks from Eddie Howe this morning after 2 windows without strengthening the team. He says the same squad can produce a staleness, a negative product. I think we're aware of that. He went on to say freshness is important, but January will be about what we're able to do rather than want. I mean, are we seeing a stale team that don't seem to be scoring defensively? They're fine, but attacking wise, it doesn't seem to be any va-va-voom there at this moment in time, Phil.
No, not in comparison to other teams who've moved quite a distance ahead. And I thought Newcastle would have a fair shout at 4th place. I didn't think they were in any way nailed on for it, and I thought there were others who would go as close. But you know, Chelsea, for example, have stepped forward in quite an impressive way and left Newcastle behind them. And it feels as if what Howe's saying about the transfer market, we've heard from him quite a lot over the past couple of years. And I think the big problem with Newcastle is that because it was Saudi Arabian investment and because it was kind of touted and portrayed as a kind of club changing ownership shift, you know, to whether you like them or not, to a group who had funding and had, you know, deep pockets, and we're going to convert Newcastle, ideally from their point of view, from kind of mid to upper table side to a side who could actually properly compete with the teams right at the top of it. And it hasn't happened. And more to the point, you know, over the past 12 months, they've started to look like they're going backwards. And I'm not sure, I think Howe is right. I'm not sure there's enough there and enough there that's new or fresh for him to drastically change this. January is not a good market. Most Premier League clubs don't like to be more active than they have to be. It doesn't tend to be a time when you pick up bargains or pick up the players that you really want. And I think, again, you know, our kind of deal sheet coverage, going through the radar we did this morning of the 25 sort of hottest properties or players most likely to move in Europe, very few of them I see moving outside the summer transfer window. They're too good, you know, too good and too valuable to be allowed to just pack up and go halfway through a season. So it's going to be next summer for Newcastle, you would think, when they can really do something about this. And I still feel like there's that question mark about how much money they're actually going to be able to spend, you know, or how much they're going to be willing to spend. And it feels like on Tyneside at the moment, there's just that little bit of confusion about where this is going versus where it was supposed to be going when the takeover first happened. Yeah,
I guess, you know, with PSR involved and all that kind of stuff, it changes things for Newcastle. But it's so interesting, the contrasting feelings we now have for Newcastle, considering when they had the takeover, and that sense of optimism versus now a sense of pragmatism. And no one was expecting this, Phil.
No, and the problem is that people say this a lot in football, that if you don't move forward, you tend to move backwards. There isn't really such a thing as standing still. And for all that there was the criticism of Chelsea's recruitment, as an example, I think people did feel that they were targeting some very good footballers. You know, people like Enzo Fernandez and Cole Palmer and Nicholas Jackson and others. There was plenty of talent there. What wasn't that obvious prior to this season starting and Maresca coming in was how it was all supposed to knit together and what the bigger picture was going to look like. You know, were they going to get a couple of years down the line and find that they had the best Premier League squad and had done exactly what they were aiming to do? Or was it just going to end up again like a dressing room of expensive misfits? And I think if I was Chelsea at the moment, I'd be pretty happy now about the road that they're on. For Newcastle, not so much. And I think they do, you know, they look to me more like a club who are likely to have the better players pinched than to add to them. You know, Anthony Gordon and Isak. I generally wonder with Alexander Isak, he would fit nicely at Arsenal. Whether or not as time goes on, that one is going to start to bubble and start to brew, because how do you keep somebody like him content if you are off the pace? You know, it becomes harder and harder as time goes by. And I just think it's going back to the summer as well. There's just been an edge of frustration in the things that Howe says and his tone. He seems, I don't know about demoralised, but I think he himself seems pretty flat about all this at the moment.
Okay, well, let's move on to Everton versus Wolves. You know, one final match to discuss. Everton against Wolves at Goodison Park on Wednesday. 2 of Everton's last 3 home Premier League matches have ended goalless, as many as in their previous 54 combined at Goodison Park. They're currently 15th, while their opponents are also in the relegation zone. Neither of these teams are coming into this game in good form at all. I took a peek at Wolves Bournemouth and it looked really optimistic, and it just dismantled so quickly, similar to Everton versus Manchester United. Everton 15th with 11 points, Wolves 18th with 9 points. I can't expect fireworks from this, or maybe we might be completely wrong.
Don't you think there's a hell of a lot of jeopardy around this? I mean, there is going to be hell to pay for whoever loses this, because it's that sort of game where you're almost being benchmarked against one of the worst sides in the division. And I get that Wolves have had a little upturn, but nothing kind of says, you know, fractious atmosphere than your own goalkeeper trying to get into the home end to argue with supporters at half time, which was what was going on with Jose Sa on Saturday. And I was writing this in Monday's newsletter and saying that the more I look at Wolves, the more you sort of think if you offered them survival in the end of the season tomorrow, they would be all over you and would say, yes, please, because this just is not going well and we haven't got started and we don't particularly look like getting started. Everton, very un-Sean Dyche-like against Manchester United in the sense of just kind of folding completely and really tamely, although from time to time it kind of does happen, and they're just stuck in that cycle with Dyche. It's not going to do him any good at all if they lose to Wolves. So although this is kind of, I guess, towards the bottom of the bill of Premier League fixtures, it's actually one of the more interesting ones, because you kind of wonder what the consequences will be if one or other team has a particularly bad night.
Yeah, for sure. All right, man. Let's leave it there. Lots to look forward to this week on the Premier League. Huge thanks to Carl earlier, Art, and also Phil as well. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back tomorrow with a look ahead to the January transfer window with none other than David Ornstein. We'll see you then. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anka, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.